Hello everyone, I'm Joey, and welcome back. Let me ask you something. When you hear news about military strikes in the Middle East, do you immediately think, that has nothing to do with me? Most people do, after all. The conflict is happening thousands of miles away. Different countries, different governments, different armies, so why should someone buying groceries in Texas, filling up a car in California, or paying rent in Florida care about what happens between the United States and Iran? The answer is surprisingly simple. Because modern economies are connected. A conflict in one region can affect fuel prices, shipping, inflation, financial markets, air travel, and even the price of everyday products sitting on supermarket shelves. That's exactly why investors around the world pay such close attention whenever tensions rise in the Middle East. During the past few days, the conflict between the United States and Iran has intensified once again. Military strikes, retaliatory attacks, and renewed concerns over the Strait of Hormuz have pushed oil markets sharply higher as traders worry about possible disruptions to global energy supplies. But what does all of this actually mean? Should Americans expect higher gasoline prices? Will inflation rise again? Could the stock market become more volatile? And why is one narrow stretch of water so important to the entire global economy? Today, we'll break it all down in simple terms. No politics, no speculation, just the economics. Let's begin. Most people have never heard of the Strait of Hormuz before a crisis begins. Yet it may be one of the most important waterways on Earth. Located between Iran and Oman, it connects the Persian Gulf with the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea. On a map, it doesn't look very large, but economically, its importance is enormous. A significant share of the world's seaborne oil exports passes through this narrow passage every day. Countries including Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Iraq, and others rely on it to move oil to customers around the world. When ships move freely, global energy markets remain relatively stable. But when conflict threatens that route, oil traders immediately become nervous. That's exactly what's happening now. Recent military actions and security concerns have slowed tanker traffic and increased fears of supply disruptions, contributing to higher oil prices. So why does oil react so quickly? Because markets don't wait for shortages to happen. They react to expectations. Imagine you own a bakery. You hear that tomorrow your flour supplier may not be able to deliver. You probably won't wait until your shelves are empty. You'll start looking for flour today. Oil markets behave in a similar way. If traders believe future supplies may become harder to obtain, they often begin buying sooner. That increased demand can push prices higher almost immediately. In other words, sometimes prices move because of uncertainty, not because supplies have already disappeared. Now let's connect that to everyday life. Oil isn't just used to make gasoline. It's one of the foundations of the global economy. It powers trucks delivering groceries, ships transporting goods across oceans, airplanes carrying passengers, farm equipment harvesting crops, factories producing thousands of everyday products, even many plastics, packaging materials, fertilizers, and household items depend on petroleum. So when oil becomes more expensive, many businesses eventually face higher operating costs. Some absorb those costs. Others pass part of them on to consumers. That's one reason economists pay so much attention to energy prices. They influence far more than what we pay at the gas station. Let's talk about gasoline. This is usually the first place consumers notice geopolitical events. Crude oil is one of the biggest components in producing gasoline. When crude prices rise, gasoline prices don't always increase immediately. But if higher crude prices persist, drivers often begin seeing higher prices at the pump over time. How much? That depends on many factors: refining capacity, transportation costs, taxes, regional supply conditions, seasonal demand, and competition among retailers. There's no automatic formula. But historically, sustained increases in crude oil have often placed upward pressure on fuel prices. Fuel prices affect much more than personal transportation. Think about delivery companies. Every package delivered to your home, every truck supplying supermarkets, Every construction project requiring heavy equipment, fuel is part of the cost. When transportation becomes more expensive, many businesses see their operating expenses increase. That doesn't necessarily mean every product becomes dramatically more expensive, but across millions of daily shipments, those additional costs can gradually spread throughout the economy. This is where inflation enters the conversation. Inflation simply means that, on average, prices for goods and services increase over time. Energy isn't the only cause of inflation, but it can be an important contributor. If transportation costs rise, manufacturing costs rise, and production becomes more expensive, some of those higher costs may eventually appear in consumer prices. That's why central banks monitor energy markets very closely. A sudden jump in oil prices can complicate efforts to keep inflation under control. Now let's look at financial markets. Whenever geopolitical uncertainty increases, investors usually begin reassessing risk. Some move money into assets they believe are relatively safer. Others reduce exposure to sectors that could be more vulnerable. Markets don't always fall during geopolitical events. Sometimes they recover quickly. Sometimes they barely react. Other times, volatility increases as investors try to understand how long the disruption might last. The important point is this: financial markets dislike uncertainty more than almost anything else, and military conflicts create uncertainty. Another area that often receives less attention is global shipping. Thousands of cargo ships move products around the world every day: electronics, clothing, machinery, food, industrial materials, energy. If shipping routes become more dangerous, insurance costs may increase. Ships may take longer routes. Transportation becomes slower. Freight becomes more expensive. Even businesses that don't buy oil directly can eventually feel those effects. That's one reason global supply chains are so sensitive to geopolitical tensions. But here's the question many people are asking right now. Could this become another global inflation shock? Could energy prices remain elevated for months? Or will markets stabilize if tensions begin to ease? And why do economists often say that expectations can be just as powerful as actual shortages? But here's the question many people are asking right now. Could this become another global inflation shock? Could energy prices remain elevated for months? Or will markets stabilize if tensions begin to ease? And why do economists often say that expectations can be just as powerful as actual shortages? Let's continue. One of the biggest misconceptions is that every conflict in the Middle East automatically causes a global recession. History tells a more complicated story. Some geopolitical crises have had only a temporary impact on financial markets. Others have led to prolonged increases in energy prices. The difference usually depends on one key factor: whether global oil supplies are actually disrupted. Markets don't react only to headlines, they react to how much oil can still reach consumers around the world. If production continues and shipping lanes remain open, markets often begin to stabilize. If supply falls significantly, the economic effects can become much larger. Another important question is, could the United States simply replace any lost oil? The answer is, partially. The United States is one of the world's largest oil producers. Countries such as Canada, Brazil, Norway, Guyana, and others also contribute significant production. However, oil is traded in a global market. Even if America produces a large amount of its own energy, global prices still matter. If international crude prices rise sharply, American consumers may still experience higher fuel prices because oil prices are influenced by worldwide supply and demand. This is why events happening thousands of miles away can still affect local gas stations. Air travel is another industry that closely watches oil markets. Jet fuel is one of the largest operating expenses for airlines. If fuel prices remain elevated, airlines may face higher costs. Sometimes those costs are absorbed by the airline. Sometimes they are reflected in ticket prices. The same principle applies to shipping companies, delivery services, construction firms, agriculture, manufacturing, and many other industries that rely on transportation. Energy affects almost every part of the economy. Many investors also ask about gold. Why does its price often rise during periods of geopolitical uncertainty? Gold has historically been viewed by many investors as a store of value during times of uncertainty. When markets become nervous, some investors move part of their money into assets they believe may better preserve value. That doesn't mean gold always rises during every conflict, but geopolitical uncertainty has often increased interest in it. The same can be true for certain government bonds and other assets considered relatively defensive. Again, every situation is different. There are no guarantees. What about the stock market? Should investors panic every time tensions increase? History suggests that emotional decisions are rarely helpful. Financial markets have experienced wars, financial crises, pandemics, oil shocks, political uncertainty, and countless unexpected events. Some market declines have lasted only days. Others have lasted much longer. Long-term market performance has depended on many different economic factors, not just geopolitical events. That's why economists often encourage people to separate short-term headlines from long-term economic trends. Central banks are also watching very closely. If higher energy prices begin pushing inflation upward again, central banks may face difficult decisions. They could choose to leave interest rates unchanged, raise them, or lower them later if inflation begins easing. Those decisions affect borrowing costs throughout the economy. Mortgages, car loans, business loans, credit cards, savings accounts. The cost of money itself is influenced by monetary policy, and energy prices can become one of many factors considered by policymakers. Let's also remember something important. Markets dislike uncertainty, but they also adapt surprisingly quickly. When new information becomes available, investors adjust, businesses adapt, shipping companies change routes if necessary, energy producers increase production when possible, governments coordinate with allies, companies search for alternative suppliers. The global economy is constantly adjusting. That doesn't eliminate short-term volatility, but it demonstrates how resilient modern markets can be. So, what should ordinary people take away from all of this? First, not every geopolitical headline will permanently change the economy. Second, oil prices influence much more than gasoline. They affect transportation, food, manufacturing, travel, and many everyday products. Third, markets often react to expectations before actual shortages occur. Finally, economic events are usually connected. A military conflict, an energy market, inflation, interest rates, consumer spending, financial markets. They're all part of the same global system. Understanding those connections makes economic news much easier to follow. The current situation between the United States and Iran is still developing. Governments continue making decisions, markets continue responding, and new information may change the economic outlook in the days ahead. That's why it's important to distinguish between confirmed facts and speculation. Nobody can predict exactly how events will unfold, but understanding the economic mechanisms behind the headlines helps us interpret the news more clearly. The next time you hear about tensions in the Middle East, you'll know the story isn't only about military strategy. It's also about energy, global trade, inflation, financial markets, supply chains, and ultimately, how events on one side of the world can influence household budgets on the other. That's the reality of today's interconnected global economy. If you found this explanation helpful and want more fact-based videos about economics, global markets, personal finance, and the forces shaping everyday life, be sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.